Brien believes the skull on the left is not human.
I doubt that the ancestors of these people are what we call Homo sapiens.
In the past, my nephew and I did a water displacement experiment to test Brien's claim that the Paracas skulls are 25% larger than human skulls. It turned out that Brien was wrong. At least he was wrong about the skulls we measured. Jackson and I were only able to measure casts, not the original thing, but locals in Peru directly measured the inside of the largest skull in their museum. They also found, like we did, that even though these skulls are longer than normal, they're also narrower. The size of their brain is human. But what about their eye sockets and other claims Brien has made? Well, buckle in, my friends. It's time for a little science. Today's video is another on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, the elongated skulls of Peru. Now, many of you know that I did a series of videos about these skulls several years ago. People on the internet were claiming that these skulls belong to aliens. The mainstream explanation for these skulls is that these are normal people, just regular South American people, who practiced skull binding, artificial cranial deformation. Brien Foerster has written a book about these, and he says that some of the Paracas skulls, some of the elongated skulls from Peru, probably are just normal cranial binding, but other ones, in particular the one that I have, he thinks that this is a different species. It's not human. The pictures that I'm showing you here, some of them are from the Mangbetu tribe in Africa, but they used to do skull elongation. They stopped, I believe, in the 50s. Skull elongation has been happening in different cultures at different times all throughout history. This person here is from France, where the practice of skull binding was popular in certain subcultures for a very long time. There's a really interesting book written in 1931 when the practice had almost completely died out. It's written by anthropologist Eric John Dingwall. He talks about the conflict between the country people who were doing the skull elongation and the French elite who wanted to have it banned because they considered it to be a form of child mutilation. To my knowledge, no one alive today has an artificially elongated skull. This practice is gone everywhere. Brien Foerster, he admits that this can happen, that people can do cranial binding, but he does not think that the skull that I have, by the way, this skull, this is a replica, this is not a real skull, this is a replica, but it is an exact replica. A company called Bone Clones makes this, and they took the original skull, the same skull that Brien Foerster has on the cover of his book, and they made a cast of it. It is accurate to the millimeter. And actually, Brien Foerster, in his book, he is the one who told me where to buy it. This is one of these skulls that he says is natural. It's not, he thinks this is not done through cranial binding. And then there are websites like Gaia.com where they suggest that this is an alien. And yeah, you know, if you don't know anything about human anatomy, if everything you know about human anatomy and everything you know about aliens comes from like the Coneheads or Star Trek, then maybe you could believe that this is an alien. But of course, Brien Foerster doesn't believe it's an alien. But Brien claims that even though these are not aliens, he doesn't think they're human. And there are 10 reasons he thinks that they are not human. In the video I did several years ago with my nephew, we tested 3 of these 10 claims. We checked to see if we could confirm them, and we found that all 3 of those were false. But people on YouTube were angry at me. They did not like that. They did not think that that was enough. Even one guy who's a fan of my work, he was a little bit upset. Flint Given, YouTuber, he says, "It seems like you just ignored evidence that didn't follow your views or the mainstream, and anything that aligned with your views you used." He's accusing me of cherry-picking the data. I said, okay, well, find every claim that Brien Foerster has made, send that to me, and I will go through each one of those. This full list right here, this full list of 10 claims that Brien Foerster has made, this comes from Flint and several other viewers who gave me this full list. Flint kindly sent me links to videos where Brien makes each of these claims. So, high five to Flint, that was super helpful. The point of this video is not to debunk Brien's claims. It's to test Brien's claims. Are they accurate or are they not? So that's what we're going to do today. It requires a little bit of rolling up of the sleeves, and I'm actually going to be doing some experimentation with this skull replica. Again, this is the exact skull Brien Foerster tells you to buy. It's the cover of his book. I'm not cheating. I am using the skull that Brien Foerster himself tells us that we should use. So let's dive in. 113 Questions About Evolution with John Perry. Evolutionary question number 33 was a new species of human found in Peru. This here is Julio Tello. He's a pretty amazing guy. He's a native Peruvian. The name that he went by publicly was a Spanish name, but he's actually full native Peruvian. According to what I've read, in his home they spoke the Quechua language, which is one of the native languages there in Peru. As a young child, he also learned Spanish, and then later on, he learned English, and he ended up going to Harvard, where he studied archaeology. And what he did is he worked with locals, he worked with natives. He discovered the Paracas culture. It's an amazing culture, advanced surgeries, all sorts of really cool things that they were doing in this culture, and they had these elongated skulls. He did not think that they were aliens, and he did not think that these elongations were caused by some sort of genetic mutation. There actually were people in his day that thought that this was a mutation, but Julio was very familiar with the process of skull elongation. In North America, there were Native American groups that had been doing that. They weren't doing that in his day, but when Europeans made early contact, the Chinook natives were doing cradle boarding, which gave them these tall triangle-shaped heads. As I mentioned earlier, in France, in Europe, people were doing skull elongation in a different way. They would bind the head right after birth all around its circumference, and that would cause the head to grow long and skinny. Here's a woman in Africa doing a very similar thing. Here's what a child looks like. This person is old enough to no longer have to wear the binding. It's bizarre, huh? It looks very uncomfortable. Here's a woman with this done, and it looks good. Here's another woman and her baby doing this. He's not wearing the straps right now, taking a break from it looks like. And here's an older woman with the skull elongation. It's a really wild practice. It really is amazing to me to look at these skulls and to know that, look at how plastic the human body is. Look at how much intense modification can happen. I mean, look at it from this angle. It looks huge. And again, because they look so bizarre, people in Julio's time thought that they might be some genetic variation, but he did not. He believed they were the result of normal skull binding. Brien Foerster does not believe that Julio is correct, and he gives 10 reasons. The first one we'll look at today is his claim that the eye sockets are about 50% larger than in normal humans.
The fact that the eye sockets are at least 50% larger than normal, that can't be explained through head binding or anything like that. That has to be genetic.
50% larger. What does Brien even mean by this? It's well documented that skull binding in France stretched the eye sockets vertically, causing eyes to bulge slightly. You can see this very clearly in photos of head binding in African children. It's super obvious in babies. It looks painful. But in adults, it seems the eye sockets are stretched vertically as well. When Brien says the sockets are 50% larger, surely he's talking about overall volume. A change in eye socket height is to be expected with skull binding, but not a change in volume. If the elongated skulls really have more volume, that really would act as proof that there is a genetic component to these elongated skulls. It would act as proof that these are not the result of normal head binding. So let's do an experiment to measure the volume of these eye sockets. So what I've done is I've got some dough here. It's just flour and water and salt, little Play-Doh. And we're just going to test the volume of the elongated skull and then see if the eyeball from the elongated skull would fit into the skull of a normal human. First, I need to put a little bit of powder in there so that it doesn't stick. Because, it's just water and wheat. And let's see if is this big enough. Then I kind of got it on the first estimate, the first try. I want to have it bulge a little bit. Let me add a little bit more dough to this. Just a little bit more dough to get the volume of that eye. Okay, so here we go. Put that in there. And that's pretty good. That's maybe it's a little bit too big. Let me pinch some of that off. Re-roll it here. So we're just trying to get the volume of this eye socket. Because again, you could stretch something upwards by skull binding, but you shouldn't be increasing the overall volume of that eye. So there we go. There you can see that I've filled that eye socket. I'm smashing it in firmly here. So make sure to go into all the crevices on the inside of the skull, of the eye socket, that is. And there we go. We've got a nicely filled eye socket. No tricks here, no editing. Let me pull this out. And in one quick move, push it over to the normal human skull and see if it fits in there. And look at that. Sure enough, that fits perfect. In fact, the eye socket of the non-elongated skull is a slightly larger volume. Look, it's not sticking out nearly as much as it did. It's not bulging out like it did on the flattened skull. What I think is going on here is that when you do skull binding, it actually pulls everything up and back a little bit, and it probably actually stops the eye socket from growing to its full depth. The eye sockets on these elongated skulls are actually smaller than they are in normal people because of the skull binding process. Now, it's also possible that it's just because this person was smaller than this person, and that's why the eye socket is slightly smaller. So there is normal human variation of eye size, but this is definitely not a 50% larger eye socket in the elongated skulls. That is just a completely false claim. And again, Brien Foerster, he never made any measurements. He just made this claim and expected people to believe it. We've tested it here the best way that we could by actually measuring the volume differences, and it turns out that his claim is indeed false. Now, claim number 2, Brien Foerster claims that there are holes on the back of these skulls that are not found in normal humans. So here's an example of that hole. This one only has one. Some of them, he says, have 2.
And then there are also these 2 holes in the back of the skull here, which are a genetic characteristic.
This is the claim that my nephew and I looked into during our earlier series. It is true that many of the elongated skulls have holes in the back, but these are normal in humans. Not all people have them, but so many people do. Scientists have given these holes a name. They are called parietal foramen. You can read all about them in anatomy textbooks or in the scientific paper I have right here on screen. The fact that elongated skulls have parietal foramen is not an anomaly indicating they are a new species. Brien's second claim in our list is also false. His third claim is that the elongated skulls do not have foramen ovale.
And then also there are things called foramen ovale, I believe they're called, which are up and inside here in the skull. That is where nerve and blood flow comes out to feed the face, and that gives us our facial expressions. They seem to be absent in the Paracas elongated skulls, which means their facial expressions would have been very different from us, which again is an abnormality.
The foramen ovale are these little holes on the bottom of the skull that are colored in green right here. He claims that the elongated skulls do not have these. If I look at my elongated skull, if I flip it over, you can see quite clearly that actually it's right here. Right there, you have, in fact, the foramen ovale. So my skull has them. And if you go and you look at the actual picture that he has on his website of his own skulls from his museum, the ones that he says don't have them, they very clearly do have them. They're right there. Brien's third claim is also false. I'm beginning to notice a pattern here. I'm not sure if I'm the only one, but I'm noticing a pattern. His fourth claim is that they are missing a sagittal suture that all normal humans have.
The suture lines. Here is the suture running across this way, but there is no sign of the sagittal suture whatsoever.
Behind me, I have a human skull that is not elongated. This guy here. And this person died fairly young, according to bone clones. This is another replica from bone clones. According to bone clones, this guy died when he was maybe in his early 30s or so. And you can see that he has, on the top of the skull, he has these little cracks. These are called sutures. There's one going across the crown of the head. That is called the coronal suture. And then there's this one that goes backwards. That's called the sagittal suture. If you look at the elongated skull, this person does have the coronal suture going across the sides, but they don't have the sagittal suture. That is missing. His claim is that that means that this is not a human. But in reality, humans go through a process called suture obliteration as they age. It doesn't always happen, not to everyone, but for a certain percentage of the population, by the age of 40, the sagittal suture starts to obliterate. It starts to completely fuse to where there's no sign of it left. And by the time you're in old age, it's often gone. The obliteration, the full obliteration of the sagittal suture is a totally normal thing for normal humans. Brien Foerster's claim is false. Next up, he says that the foramen magnum is oval in the elongated skulls, where in humans it is round.
Also, the opening of the foramen magnum appears to be oval and not round as it is in Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's another abnormality.
So again, here we're looking at a normal human skull, and we're going to look underneath at the foramen magnum, which is this really large hole here. Foramen means hole, magnum is like, big, the big hole underneath the skull. And if we look at the elongated skull, the first thing that we notice really is that the elongated skull has a smaller foramen magnum, and sure enough, it's also oval. But if you do a quick search for the normal size and shape variation of foramen magnum in humans, you find that both the shape and the size is completely normal. Different people have different sized and different shaped foramen magnum. This is just normal human variation. Brien's claim that it is not is, again, false. Next claim, their foramen magnum is further back than in normal humans.
In the original elongated skulls of this area, the foramen magnum is a full 1 inch back from where it's supposed to be, because with us, of course, it's at the balance point, so it's almost in the center. But the original Paracus, it's basically 1 inch backwards.
So here I have the elongated skull, and if we flip it over, we see that, well, it actually looks like the foramen magnum is in the middle. It's where it should be. Why does Brien's picture look so much different than the skulls do in real life? Well, it's because he's holding it at an angle. If you hold the skull like this, it does look like the foramen magnum is positioned in the far back of the head. But that's because it's being held at a weird angle. If we just hold it at a more reasonable angle, we see that the foramen magnum is exactly where it's supposed to be. In the elongated skull, the back of the skull has actually been smashed in. So it is a little bit hard to place it if you're trying to look at the back of the skull. But if you look at this part right here, if you just look at the roof of the mouth and measure backwards, you find that it's actually in exactly the right spot. It's in exactly the same spot as it is in a normal human being. Not only is Brien's claim false, this is a classic camera trick. Claim number 7, their brain cases are 25% larger in volume than a human's. As mentioned in the intro of this video, this claim has been tested by many people. Local people in Peru with access to museum specimens have directly measured the inside of the brain cases. Jackson and I measured the total volume of the outside of the cast of an elongated skull. The very cast that Brien tells people to buy in his book happens to be the cast of the specimen on the cover of his book. All of the measurements I am aware of have found that the elongated skulls, even though they are longer than normal, they are also more narrow than normal, meaning the total volume of the brain case itself, it's well within the normal human range, exactly what you would expect with head binding. It's worth pointing out that Brien, so far as I can tell, has never measured the volume of an elongated skull. In fact, in his book, he explains how he concluded that the skulls are 25% larger than normal. He just speculated the volume. He even says it hasn't yet been proven. My nephew and I did a game show episode where we ask viewers to estimate the volume of different shaped beer mugs to see if they can do so accurately. So one of these cups is missing 40 milliliters, and one of these cups has an extra 40 milliliters. Now, just so you know, the coloring here has nothing to do with anything. I did the coloring afterwards, so don't use that as a hint. Pause the video and try to figure this out for yourself. We gave viewers an entire week to try and figure this out. This was the result. 89 people played, and every single one of them got it wrong. In fact, one person, Miss Roshen, somehow managed to get it perfectly wrong. Humans are terrible at judging the volume of irregularly shaped objects by eye. Brien's claim here, once again, is false. At least he was wrong about the skulls we measured. Brien also claims that the elongated skulls are heavier than normal. To my knowledge, he never gives us any measurements. Brien never tells us how heavy a skull is supposed to be, and he never tells us how heavy the Paracas skulls are. Claim number 8, the Paracas people were born with elongated skulls, where humans are not. Brien doesn't give us any evidence to back up that claim. In some of his videos and on his tours, he does show small children with elongated skulls. But of course, we know from the photographs of the African group that does skull elongation, people start this right away. And then Brien's claim that humans are never born with elongated skulls, that claim is actually false. It's actually really common for humans to be born with elongated skulls if they had a rough birth. In most cases, it'll turn round again. Here's another example. The reason that happens, here's a cast of a baby skull, a newborn skull. And you can see that the skull is made of little plates, and there's soft tissue between those plates. And it's very, very pliable when a baby is first born. I should point out that if you go on the alien UFO websites that talk about elongated skulls, they will tell you that early explorers found a mummy, and inside that mummy was an unborn child, and that unborn child had an elongated skull. Here's the drawing that's presented with that. There are several striking things about this drawing. First of all, obviously, drawings are not evidence of anything. But back in those days, it was probably the best that they could do. So we'll give them a pass there. But the skull on this thing does not look like the skull of a fetus. Again, a fetus is going to have multiple bone plates in the head. Furthermore, this supposed fetus has teeth. Fetuses don't have teeth. So riddle me this. What's more likely? These early explorers discovered an alien fetus and then lost it. All we have now is this drawing. Sucks to be us. Should have been there. Or the artist who drew what he saw didn't remember very well what it was that he actually saw. Or they were shown a child that had already started head binding and had already grown teeth. I know I have my opinions, but what do you think is more likely? So with claim number 8, the first part of that claim is a little bit dubious. I doubt that all of the Paracas people were born with elongated skulls, but any of them that had a rough birth, they might have been born with slightly elongated skulls, just like normal humans. Brien claims that humans are never born with elongated skulls, and that claim is false. Claim number 9, a preliminary study found their DNA is not human. If my video here is the only one you've ever seen of Brien's work, at this point you might be thinking he's a scam artist. In the videos I make, I've actually come across quite a few scam artists, and I don't think Brien is one of them. Gaia, the company that interviews him quite often, they are scam artists. They are, I would say, the used car salesman of woo-woo spiritualism. But I do believe Brien is sincere. I think the errors that he makes are simply because he's so excited about these elongated skulls. It's difficult for him to think about them critically. And one of the reasons that I say that I don't think he's actually a scam artist, he's not trying to trick people, is because of the way that he's dealt with this claim. At one point, he had some DNA testing done, and afterwards he made a claim that suggested these things might have alien DNA. He said that the DNA had mutations in it unknown to any human or animal. But it looks like after making that claim, someone who understands genetics sat down and talked to him about it, because in the clip I'm about to show you, he corrects himself, and his explanation for what was going on here is really well done. Just for some context here, Brien was invited to speak at a conference. During Brien's talk, he did not mention the DNA It seems like he had already decided that that was inappropriate, and he gets called out for it here at the end.
Haven't you buried the lead? The thing that stimulated me and got me motivated to get in touch with you was the reference that I came across, which says that some genetic tests that have been done have found that the DNA in the skulls that were, quote, unknown in any human, primate, or animal known so far.
That's true. That slide, unfortunately, was missing. But initial DNA testing has shown that there are segments of DNA from at least one Paracas skull that doesn't fit Homo sapiens or Denisovan or any known humanoid. And so that became something which was blasted around the planet, and of course I was attacked heavily for it. But that is why now we're working with the Peruvian government and having multiple samples sent to a genetics laboratory, or in fact, the University of California contacted me 2 days ago and said that they would do free genetic testing for us, because this is an incredibly expensive procedure. If you have your blood sample taken, of course, you can find out wherever it is that your ancestors came from, etc. But these people mysteriously died out 2,000 years ago, and DNA breaks down just like any organic material would. So something which is DNA, which is 2,000 years ago, requires the most advanced computer programming to try to reassemble these tiny pieces of DNA. And that's basically where we are at right now.
Brien did a great job explaining what's going on there. I couldn't have done better myself. The initial tests that he had done were just normal DNA tests, but his sample was ancient. It had been beaten up for thousands of years by sunlight and radiation and just, the elements. And so, of course, it had mutations in it. It had DNA breaks in it that no other human has. When Brien was taught how this works, he seems to have accepted it. So claim number 9 was false and has been corrected by Brien himself, and it has been replaced with claim number 10. According to Brien, some of the DNA results say that these are normal Native Americans, like you would expect, and some of the DNA tests he had done found hints of DNA from Europe and from the Middle East. Brien has not released the raw data from those tests. His GoFundMe page does have a couple of photos from a computer screen showing what he claims to be some of the results, but none of the raw data. Instead, he's selling a book about it, and he made some YouTube videos. Last week, I asked him for the raw data. He has not responded to my request, but at any rate, it's not super relevant to this video. Remember, we started out asking, was a new species discovered in Peru? To that, the answer is no. But Brien now thinks the Paracas people may have been from the Middle East. Given his track record, I'm going to go ahead and take that claim with a healthy grain of salt. Whew! That was a very long video. I don't think that people can accuse me honestly of cherry picking any longer. Let me end by just again reminding you that this summer I will be joining Nancy on her evolution tour in Ecuador, in the Amazon jungle. We're going to see all sorts of animals. I'm giving multiple lectures on evolution, and I really hope that you join me for that, because it's going to be a ton of fun. Go to evotour.info for details. So long for now.